Hey everyone, welcome back to UPROAR Live. My name is Carl Gladstone and I get to serve as the producer of Creative Conspiracies with Motor City Wesley. We're a student and young adult organization here in Detroit. We try to help students connect to create, to I'm rusty. It's been a long summer. We support students in their efforts to create communities of justice and equity, create projects that bring goodness into the world, and to surround that all in a process of kind of spiritual development and growth. And it's a great joy to be a part of that. We've been going since 2009, and we are excited to look into all the ways that and all the places around Metro Detroit that are gathering students, particularly in new ways right now during the COVID-19 crisis, where we've got a lot of students in town who may be doing school on campuses elsewhere around Michigan or the world. So we are here in person, and we're kind of just reaching out our hand of support to any of those students and other campus ministries around who need that kind of in-person touch here in the city. One of the ways that we're excited about gathering people in virtual and hopefully in-person settings when we can are through these teach-ins and through our partnership with G's Magazine. And today we get the wonderful opportunity to talk with folks from G's and panelists and guests about the recent issue, CO2 Conspirators Communing with Trees. So I want to introduce Kateri and Lydia, who are going to tell us a little bit more about what we'll talk about today. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Carl. It's lovely to be with this circle, and wish we were all in physical space with one another, but grateful for this time together. I'm Lydia Wiley-Kellerman and the editor of G's. And G's, for those who don't know, is a quarterly ad-free print magazine at the intersection of art, activism, and spirit. At best, we offer a prophetic and provocative voice for the institutional church and a pastoral presence for those that are laboring on the front lines of social change. And I'll let Kateri say a little bit more about this particular issue that came out this summer.
Sure. Thanks, y'all. It's great to be here with all of you in the circle and everyone watching. I'm Kateri. I'm the associate editor and circulation manager for G's. And we're going to talk about our summer issue, which is on trees. And so you can see we're a primarily print magazine, but we do list a few articles from each issue online, which is on the screen right now. So when we were planning themes for this issue, this was before the pandemic, before Uprising, and we had wanted for a long time to do something focusing on trees, and started going through this process before so much of the world has turned around on its head. And for us, this issue was a really grounding way through all of the madness of the last few months. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from readers too that it's been a similar thing even in the midst of all of it. So we ended up, through the pitches that we received and that we were working with, we ended up sort of discovering these multiple ways of describing how we relate to trees or how we might view them. Some of the categories that we worked with are trees as kin, trees as prophet, trees as medicine, trees as haven, trees as witness, and trees as beings. And each of the sections in the issue has pieces and artwork and poetry from each of those ways of relating. And of course, there are so many more. But for this podcast, we're going to focus on trees as kin in particular. And we think that through all of this that the world is going through right now, this is particularly important, even though it feels there's so much urgency in the world right now. It feels like such a slow process at times. We feel that it's going to be really important for all of us to be focusing on. So we're really excited to have two folks here with us who wrote on this topic and we think can speak to it from each of their own perspectives and lives. So I'd just like to ask each of you, Jim and Adrian, to introduce yourselves, and you can just say a little bit about where you're broadcasting from, maybe how you've been spending your time the last few months, and anything else you'd like to share about your life. So let's start with Adrian, and then we'll pass it to Jim.
Sure. So my name is Adrian Downey. I am broadcasting from Canada, from beautiful, sunny Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the east coast of Canada. And it's the unceded and unpurchased territory of my brothers and sisters, the Willistok Nation, who are the people of the beautiful and bountiful river, which is the river that runs through our province. It was named the St. John River after, presumably after St. John. But its original name is the Willistok, which means the beautiful and the bountiful. And so the people who lived here since time immemorial, the Willistok Nation, are the people of that river, who live in a kinship relationship with that river. And they're connected to my own people, the Mi'kmaq, through a pre-contact political organization, political international relationship called the Wabanaki Confederacy. And so originally I'm from Nova Scotia, which is another province in Canada, but our peoples share a long history together and a long history of kinship as well. So, yeah. Oh, and I guess what I've been doing recently is reading a lot of books. I'm a PhD student, so I've been doing that kind of thing for the past couple months.
Thanks, Adrian. We can pass it over to you, Jim.
Yeah, so thank you for the invitation to be here with everybody. I'm coming from Detroit, Anishinaabe territory, also Wendat, Huron, Sauk, Fox, Miami. Detroit is a word that designates the river as a strait. Anishinaabe groups used to call the place Wawiatanong, where it goes around. It's a big bend in the river. And I came to Detroit from Cincinnati more than 35 years ago, landed in the inner city, part of an activist Christian community in a predominantly low-income African-American neighborhood, part of the poorest congressional district in the country at that point in time. Right now, I'm tucked to downtown in a grove, 60-year-old locust trees, about 8 blocks from the river. I am an activist, artist, leader. Already have the PhD that my co-presenter is doing, and have been teaching. I've been reading a lot of books as well, but also doing a lot of Zoom like everybody else, and tired of the technology. But also spending time with my Filipino wife, who is also an educator, activist, artist. Keeping up with our teaching responsibilities, but taking breaks and going out and being with the trees and finding real relief from the technology out among the leaves and the grass, and a little park nearby here.
Thank you both. I'm wondering if each of you would be willing to read a short excerpt from your piece, and maybe share a little bit about your experience with the tree that each of you wrote about. Maybe we'll begin again with Adrian, if you're willing.
Yeah, I'll defer on the reading a piece because I didn't prepare anything, but so the piece I wrote was about, and I'll actually do you one better and show you the piece of birch bark which is hanging there on my wall, that I wrote the piece about. But essentially it's, last spring, I was doing research for, reading a lot of books on posthumanism and on literature in Atlantic Canada and the literary history of my own people, the Mi'kmaq, and thinking a lot about our birch bark writing system, and some of the history around that and some of the teachings that go along with that. So I was thinking a lot about that, and I was also thinking about discard studies, the way we engage with waste, kind of generally. Western society is a very wasteful society sometimes. And there's this whole movement in discard studies to think about waste. And so I was walking kind of home from the university, and there's a parking lot I pass through every day, and there was this piece of birch bark just kind of drifting in the wind, and I was like, oh, that's so weird. And it kind of stayed with me for a week, and we kind of built a relationship that way, where I would see it and I would think about it, and I couldn't shake that feeling of all these thoughts I was having and the feeling it was evoking in me. And so one day I just kind of picked it up and took it home. And yeah, we, eventually, you'll have to read the story to find out how it ends, but we ended up co-authoring a piece together, the birch, as I call it,
Yes.
Yeah, and so it was kind of a weird experience where it wasn't, anything I expected, and it just kind of, it moved me. This thing that everybody was walking past that, for 2 weeks was just there, but it was such a beautiful thing to me and meant so much. And it was alive, and I wanted to engage with it creatively, and it wanted to engage with me, I think. So we, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. So I think keep going with the questions. I'm not sure if Jim's here. Maybe that's him, but I'll go on to the next question. Jim. So
That bumping over to me, I can barely hear with the technology.
oh, good. Yep. Yeah. Let's go to you now, Jim.
Yeah, if you would be willing to read a short excerpt from your piece.
Again, sorry, the connection's not very good, and there's so much static. Listening to you all is like my attempt to listen to these. I'm experiencing. I'll read a little piece. Is that good? And then, is that what you were asking?
Yes. And we're having a little trouble hearing you too, but hopefully it'll stay on.
I come to that hour again. I'm sorry? Yeah. I come to that hour again. The afternoon sun slanting with mystery across the locust tree trunk outside my window. A young boy playing on a neighborhood slope as the great yellow orb of day settles into the slow gait toward shadow, soon to jump off the horizon into the waiting jaws of night. The sycamore looming in warm glow and dappled opens, the boundary of flesh, now a meeting of kin. With the gush of beauty pouring in my pores like a spirit rush from the other side, inseparable as a heart from its beat, comes also grief, my first taste. I have no words. It will take a lifetime. So that was an early moment of being overwhelmed as a child by the experience of a summer afternoon, late afternoon, anchored in a sycamore tree, where both beauty and the loss of beauty made their presence known in my body. And of course, age of 5 or 6, however old I was, I didn't have language for it. I lend my adult tongue now back to that experience. But it was falling across the threshold that separates us from other species, and suddenly being alive to a much bigger presence than the reduced colonial presence that European settler folk brought with them, packaged in a tight Christianity. Towards that bigger self in relationship to African American inner city folk in Detroit, Native folk here, my Filipino wife's people, but also in relationship to non-human species, and among them trees, trying to recover a sense of being a big watershed person, and fumbling at it and messing up all the time.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both for sharing more, in the magazine and now. And sort of leading into my next question, which is just that both of your pieces recount pretty intimate experiences, or at least that's a word I'm giving them. You can feel free to say that doesn't resonate. But there are at least experiences that are not commonly shared about in mainstream white Western culture, at least. And so I was curious just how it felt for you, or maybe even feels now, to share something about that, put it out into the public through the magazine. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it felt like nothing, or maybe there was more to it. And so maybe we'll start with Adrian again, and then you can pass it over to Jim.
Yeah, sure. Jim, that was beautiful, by the way. Thank you for sharing that. So a couple thoughts kind of like jump out at me in relation to that. I think, so all my academic work kind of fits within that really weird niche of being extremely personal as well as academic. And I carry that over in anything I do. And I try to live by the motto that personal narrative disrupts dominant narrative. And so if we think about, the dominant narratives in our society around, waste, or around trees, that they're inanimate, whatever it may be, I try to tell my own stories that disrupt those notions. And that's, if you think about the intellectual kind of roots of that, you can think about phenomenology or feminism or critical race theory, the storytelling, the disruptive storytelling element of that. I like to go back to indigenous traditions that, our story is, Thomas King famously wrote in his 2003 Massey Lectures that the truth about stories is that's all we are. And I think that really speaks to why we're here, those stories, and making sense of that. So that's one thing. I try to be as transparent and live as authentically as possible. I was reminded fairly recently, got taken to task, and for good reason, that there's also a privilege that comes with that sharing, that as somebody who occupies the body I occupy, that I can afford to take those risks a bit more freely. And it's not only a privilege, it's also an obligation to do that work and to be vulnerable and to be willing to be corrected, and to live with an open heart, but also be willing to hear the difficult truths that come with that. That your experiences may have hurt somebody, or that somebody may take damage with your story, or may take issue with your story, and you have to be willing to hear that as well, with the same open heart that you shared originally, I think. So it's Yeah, I don't have a good summary statement for that.
That was great. No, thank you so much. It's really helpful to hear about some of the, like, that this isn't a new thing for you to be sharing like that, and that this is part of ways that you're intentionally doing what you see as work and maybe even obligation. So I appreciate that. And Jim, we can pass it over to you now. Just sharing how it felt to share that story.
Yeah, for me, it wasn't outside of my normal experience. I've lived most of my adult life in ways that aren't all that commonly approved. More than 15 years after I first arrived in Detroit, living in with as many as 50 adults and 20 children, put assets on a poverty level budget, black and white, married and single, and another extended, and sort of stepping out of my lower middle class training, having to relearn life in a very different space in relationship to a very different ethnic people under the same roof, those households. And for me, like Adrian was saying, I think in Dijanker, what is sustainable and just in a way that most other groups of people do not. As climate change rolls in on us, as COVID-19 is a kind of message about our aggression on non-human habitat, particularly bat habitat. Black Lives Matter, channeling the deep sub-history of this country that has never been dealt with. Facing all that, I think for me, a full halt. All your assumptions about what it means to be a human being are in question. And it's pushed us to look around and ask what actually works, who actually, in our ways of living on the planet, both in the past and now, actually knows how to live in place in relationship to the plants and animals, water, weather, soils, seasons of a given, in such a way that regress on other folk, exploit, and from
Looks like some of those technical problems are hitting Jim, unfortunately. We'll bring him right back in as soon as his feed gets back.
It feels very appropriate for geez. I know this is not Motor City's way, but this is Jesus' way to have lots of technical difficulties if we try to do anything that's not in print.
No, we're totally there with you. Yes, we're great opportunity to say anybody that's watching.
From,
hey Jim, thanks. Welcome back. We
way of living.
We lost you there for just a minute, and but we want to bring you back in. And just a word, if anybody, as people are watching, feel free to kind of let us know what you're thinking, some comments and things, and we can build that into the conversation as well. All right, I'll get back out of the way.
Jim, are you there? Can you hear me? All right, I'm going to go ahead and move to the next question for Adrian, and hopefully we'll keep having Jim come back in clearly. But Adrian, wondering if you could say a little bit about what, if anything, you were taught about trees as a child. I think about that a lot in raising my own kids and that work, and yeah, would just love to hear from your own experience.
For sure. So when I think about my own upbringing, I spent a lot of time around trees, particularly like we had a wood fireplace in our house, and we were morally opposed to like buying wood from other people, I guess. So that necessitated a lot of like working with trees in terms of like piling logs against a fence, or even going with my dad to kind of chop them up and to make firewood. So there was that side of things. There was also like, um, my mother's side, where it was teaching about which trees could be used for which purposes, that kind of thing. So I think I wrote about it in the piece I had for G's about birch bark being very flammable, and we would use it to start fires and things like that. So those are the two major ones. I think a little bit later in my life, when I started coming back to traditional Indigenous teachings, I learned about the importance of a reciprocal relationship with trees, that if we take a tree from its home, that we need to offer something in return. And so often that's the tobacco offering that we give when we take a tree, or we take something from the tree. So there was that. I'd also, the thing that's like in my mind right now is Leanne Simpson has a really great piece called Pedagogy of the Land, where she talks about the sugar bush trees with the Anishinaabe. And that's a really great piece. It talks about a consensual relationship with trees as well, and learning consent from the tree and what that looks like. So I'd highly recommend that to anybody interested in that kind of thing.
Jim, are you back? You hear us?
Oh,
The
man.
challenges of this work.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrian, for the recommendation too. I'd love to we can put that also in the notes so that we make sure folks have access to that name and title. And I'll move on to the next question for you. It's actually about a line in your piece. So you wrote about Donna Haraway, and also definitely I'll make that recommendation for folks too, if folks don't know her, to check out her work. So you write, Donna Haraway is adamant that human beings must begin to make kin with the plants and animals around us. And of course, it's not just Donna saying that. That's certainly a theme among so many folks right now, and has been for so long. But you reference her work in particular, and I guess I'm curious to ask you where and how you see this happening today, and who are you turning to as teachers, maybe both human and non-human. Anything you can share about that would be great.
For sure. Donna Haraway is like my hero, first of all. But so Haraway herself has some really great examples of this happening. Like in the real world, she talks about messenger pigeons and kind of the intimate relationship that humans build with birds in that kind of a capacity, and tells that story really well in her book, Staying with the Trouble. And there's also, numerous literary examples of this, and Donna Haraway as well has, her science fiction kind of at the end of that book, where she talks about being a symbiote with animal species.
Can you turn on? But on the phone, so it's not searching.
Oh. Should I just keep going, or? Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. The other piece, I think, in terms of so kinship is a foundation of Indigenous thought, and there's a lot of people that write about it really well, but I take a lot of learning from Daniel Heath Justice, who's a Cherokee literary scholar, and writes about kinship and relationality. And one line that sticks out for me is that idea that we can raise each other up as we hold each other to account, that they're not mutually exclusive. And so I think about that in terms of justice of all sorts, thinking about racial justice and having those difficult conversations with people and holding them to account, but in a way that's loving, that we also raise them up for the good that they do. And not necessarily tearing people down, but also thinking about that, so that notion of kinship and that idea of raising each other up and holding each other to account in terms of our non-human others. So the plants that are around us, if they could speak, and they can, of course, we just can't hear them in the ways that we're accustomed to. If they could speak, what would they say about our relationship with them? Would they be consenting to the ways in which we're engaging with them? Would they express love, gratitude to us for, the way we're engaging with them? How would they hold us to account? To what standard of relationality, of kinship would they hold us? So thinking about these kind of ideas, I'm a philosophical person, so that's the direction I go in. In a more tangible way, I think, urban farming, building that relationship, especially with, the French is in my mind, le petit enfant, the young children, like getting them out and engaging in, hands in soil kind of thing, building that relationship. I think it's good work, and that builds that relationship for sure.
I'm going to read a short piece from Jim's piece that he writes. Had I an iPhone, it would not have mattered. Any halt would have been mere idle and trapping me, missing inevitably this giant other. And just thinking about technology, which is something we think a lot about at G's, but how might technology be affecting our ability to grow and deepen relationships with trees and other than human world? Are iPhones and Google and social media only an impediment to those relationships and to kin making, or are there ways that technologies can serve these relationships? And Jim, if you're there and can hear us, I'd love to hear from you first. And otherwise, we'll pass it to Adrian.
So who were you asking?
If you're there, Jim, we'll have you speak first.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't actually know if you're hearing me. I'm not hearing back from you, but yeah, for me, technology is a big question, obviously, in the way it's showing up right here in our interaction with each other. I remember visiting my mom a number of years ago in her retirement village, assisted living. She was probably about 102 years old at that point in time. And an aide came into the breakfast room, which had a number of windows on the south and east side. So the sun was pouring in at 8 o'clock in the morning. The aide said, "Oh, the blinds, trees freak me out. I'm scared of trees." And I was shocked, and so were everybody else in the room. But I've encountered that more than once in folk who've grown up in the city and whose relationship is so technologically mediated that actually having a relationship with a wild creature like a tree is frightening. to them. I think that one of the, I would say is we're in a dilemma right now with COVID-19, having to rely on technology to try to do tracking and to address the public health dimensions of the crisis on the one hand. On the other hand, that's ratcheting up the ability of the state to do surveillance and to tighten its grip on us as citizens in all kinds of ways. I was just reading a week ago about new technology, drone technology now, that we will soon be able to buy drones that are an inch in diameter that can carry a 1 gram charge that can penetrate skulls. And the article was talking about this new AI weapons technologies that will eventually be available to everybody, so that 3 people could wipe out 1 million people with only a 10% kill rate with these things. And the only way to guard them is to further increase surveillance. And the article was saying we might be in a situation where we have to enfranchise an algorithm as a kind of philosopher king in a world government structure to monitor what's happening with these bio, nano, micro technologies of weapons, which for me is an indication of the way the principalities and powers in their plurality compete with each other to ever more ruthlessly lock down our species and all other species in this dynamic of control. So I look at that, I see that happen on all sides, and for me, I don't have a lot of hope that technology at this point is an answer. Certainly it can be a tool, but the onus for me is on recovering face-to-face, body-to-body, breath-to-breath relationships with wild beings and with each other, and relearn how to be a species on the planet in a way that's not self-destructive.
Thanks, Jim. Pass that to Adrian if you've got thoughts on.
For sure, I couldn't have said that better myself. It's interesting just kind of thinking out loud about this one. Leanne Simpson has this notion of constellations of co-resistance, and she talks about allyship between non-white people, indigenous people, people of color, that kind of thing, diasporic peoples, resisting the structures of settler colonialism, dismantling them together and decentering white allyship in that process. And she talks about the way social media has been used, but at the same time, it's implicated within all those neoliberal structures of governance that Jim mentioned. And so it's complicated. And kind of where she ends with that is that we can make use of those networks, but nothing will replace that on the ground co-resistance, those kind of interpersonal relationships that we mobilize toward dismantling settler colonialism, dismantling racism, those kind of things. Something else about technology that I'll kind of throw out there is, so Marshall McLuhan, the kind of famous Canadian media ecologist, says that technology, a new piece of technology, doesn't just change the world, it creates a new world. And I think I have to constantly remind myself of that, that we can't go back, right? Like we've had, our world has had access to these different technologies, whether it's, that which by we are mediated today, this kind of connectivity or not. We can't kind of retreat back to, as idyllic as it might be, whatever time in the past that we idealize, right? It's always going to be something new. And so I think that's a hopeful notion more than it is a dismissive one or a negative one, that we have the potential to create something new we just have to, we really, really have to take the lessons of the past into that future. We can't kind of continue the status quo. We can't try to repeat something that was to make something great again that was great in the past. We really have to build something new, and technology can be a part of that. It might even be the main part of that, but it's not the only part, and it's not the only thing to think about.
Appreciate that from both of you. And yes, it's always ironic to be having these conversations via the screen, especially seeing how much we all have to be relying on this way of relating if we want to continue in the same way that we were, now that we can't be so face to face. But it's good to be talking about it in the midst of all this. So also just shifting in terms of what the last few months have looked like with the pandemic and quarantine. One of the pieces that we did get to include in the issue that is more COVID, that was like birthed in the COVID moment, was from Nicola Torbett. It's the opening of the issue and of the section that you both wrote in. And she writes about an experience of going to the redwoods and asking them what they think about all of this. And it ends with them just sort of assuring her, she's sort of asking them what this virus might mean. And she says, would it be better for you if we were gone, we humans? And she says they were dumbfounded by the question. They said, oh, honey, only a human could even conceive of such a question. We would never desire or imagine we could benefit from your death. That's your kind of thinking. So there's much more that Nicola writes about in that, but I just wanted to pull that out as a way I think many folks, whether maybe they're naming it this way or not, have been turning to the outdoor world or to trees, more particularly in these months when we have to be more isolated from each other. And I'm wondering if either of you have found yourself doing that. You've already referenced that a little bit, Jim. And if there's any messages that you've been receiving that you would feel comfortable sharing. So I think we'll start with Jim now again and just see if that works. And then if not, we'll go to Adrian.
So this would be messages received from wild nature about the situation we're in. Is that the question? It's still broken up for me.
Yes. And
is that right?
Yes. Or anything else you've heard about that.
Yeah. I think what I would say is messages other than what I mentioned before. There's a colleague of Lily's who wrote a poem ventriloquizing COVID-19 to us as human beings, basically saying, I'm not the enemy, I'm just the messenger. Well, and you can be well if we're not well. And the poem goes on and fleshes out that kind of message that is coming, I think, all over from the biosphere, that we as a species to cover a sense of mutuality and reciprocity, which I think fundamentally means a sense of limitation. So the thing that I think is really on the table right now in terms of whether we as a species go extinct, along with 200 species per day going extinct with us right now, or find a viable way of being all together on the planet, I think a big piece of that question rests with whether we're able to impose limits on ourselves. in all kinds of ways, not least of which is limiting our technological capabilities, not doing everything we're capable of doing in terms of our re-engineering of the planet, but being able to impose a limit. And I would understand indigenous cultures doing that through ritual and myth. They told stories and enacted those stories in ritual interaction with the non-human world in a way that effectively limited the uptake of their community members in relationship to everything else, out of the understanding that the world is put together such that everything is eating everything else. And every time we rip a hole in the fabric of the rest of the world, and we owe back in relationship to that, we owe beauty, we owe respect, we owe grief for what we've taken, and the recognition that we too will be eaten one day. And I think indigenous cultures were genius at one way or another codifying that for their communities so that the community didn't get overblown in relationship to their ecological niche. Now I think we're in a situation where we have wildly exceeded our place on the planet, and whether you understand that as going back or going forward into a newness, I think it one way or another needs to make use of what indigenous cultures knew about keeping small and humble and limited.
Thank you, Jim. So we can go to you, Adrian, on this question about messages that you might be receiving, or even just how you feel about that framework, or if there's anything else you're thinking about that now.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. I mean, since the pandemic hit, the obvious thing that I've been kind of more aware of is microbes, and how alive our world is beyond trees, beyond animals, beyond kind of those things we think of as alive. You know, COVID-19, the virus itself is alive, and it's in a very real way. And even thinking about gut bacteria, or bacteria on our skin, things like that, germs. These are living beings, and so I sort of ask the question: what would those others say of how we have lived our relationship with them? Thinking about that reciprocity, thinking about that kinship. How would they hold us to account? What does this COVID-19 virus, or a particular virus, any virus, what is our relationship to it? Is it one of fear? Is it one of hate? Is it one of, and what does that say about the greater Zoe, life in general? So that's one thing. I saw a comment in the chat about, so it says there's currently a temperature study going on in the US that determines areas where ambient temperatures are rising. And I think about that a lot too, because it's really, really hot and dry in Fredericton right now. We've had like maybe 2 days of rain in the last 2 months. And I also just finished reading Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower and the Parable of the Talents. And so that's kind of a dystopian future that's not too far in the future and seems really realistic. And thinking about, having a summer with like 2 days of rain is pretty bizarre for the East Coast. And just worrying, I guess, about my brothers and my sisters, the trees, and concerned that they're not getting enough water, and wondering, what can I as one person do about that? I have some answers about what that action is, but I only have one watering can. I can,
Get that a lot. One of the things that is one of the joys of making a quarterly print magazine is that you're writing in a different historical moment than you're doing the layout, and you're sending it to print in a different historical moment than when it lands in people's hands. And we certainly felt that with this issue, beginning it last winter. And knowing that this issue was written before George Floyd was murdered, and it landed in the hands of folks in the midst of the uprisings and resistance to the movements that continue to follow. And so I'd love to hear from both of you if you think that making kin with trees is related to on-the-ground resistance work, and how and where, or what does or could that look like? And again, we'll start with Jim, if you're able to hear that.
Yeah, my response would be along the lines of what I have been saying, in that I think there is a deep relationship. Part of the way we have used discourses of race and gender to render expendable large percentages of the human species is to liken them to animals, or even Mesopotamia, when the first city-states arose, laborers were talked about by the elites as a form of crop. It was indicative of those elites pulling themselves out of actual interaction with plants and animals, and increasingly adopting a supremacist point of view towards the rest of the biosphere and most of the human species that they were coercing into laboring to produce surplus product for them as elites to live on. And so I think the issue is not pulling all of our species up to the level of elite ways of living and thinking. It's patently impossible for a planet of 7.6 billion to live even the North American middle class lifestyle. It would take 3 to 5 more planets to do that. I think the issue is rather to the other direction, recover a way of understanding human beings, plants, animals, even water and soil, as living creatures that we are living symbiotically with. And at that level, relating well across differences inside our species that we've made related to race, gender, class, sexuality, is all of a piece with relating well with ways we differentiate ourselves from the non-human world. And I think the two are intimately related. I would say one last thing. On the other hand, I do think it's necessary to take seriously what we've had to come to grips with, or having to come to grips with the environmental movement, that it has so far in the Western world styled itself in terms that are primarily white and middle class, has not been conversant with the efforts of indigenous people for centuries, and dismissive of those efforts in many cases. So that, yes, there's a way in which even all of this concern for trees, among other things, can easily, one more time, reproduce race and class realities.
So I'll jump right in there if I can. because kind of my response to that really picks up on that last point Jim made, if I heard it correctly. So if I didn't, please, Jim, feel free to correct me. But there is a long history of kind of white environmentalism that has not looked at the intersections of race and class and gender and many of our intersections. And so some of the post-human work that's coming out, particularly Rosie Berdoity, works under this assumption that we are all in this together, but we are not all the same. And I really love that phrase as a way of kind of encapsulating this idea that we are all, even our non-human others, we are all kind of in this world together, and we have to make sense of it and make the most of it. But we're not all the same. We don't all experience life in the same ways. Some of us are impressed by various social structures in various ways. And so unity, and this really is something I think a lot about in terms of politicians in COVID-19 and the discourse that emerges from that of unity, that we're all in this together and we have to kind of work together. We do, sure, but let's not erase the fact that, you know, Indigenous people, people of color, all the various other hierarchies, you know, are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Apart from all the other issues of race, police brutality, those kind of things. So, you know, that's when I talk about moving into the future and not forgetting that past. I think that's really important to me, that, you know, as we move forward, those are the things we have to keep in mind. And not just in mind, but in our actions, in our thoughts, and that, you know, we don't enter into a space without first, you know, interrogating that space and finding out, you know, what the history of that space is. And if there aren't people of color in a particular space, like there's not today, you know, why are there not people of color in that space? And so I'll be transparent about the fact that I was reticent to appear on this podcast without first asking the question about, you know, are there other voices that might be better suited to this space, who might have something different to say, and I'm sure the two people from G's here can share their response to that as well. But before that, the last thing I'll say is I'll return back to that notion of we can raise each other up and hold each other to account, that they're not mutually exclusive. And I think that's so important in our daily work, in our interactions with one another. I tell the students I work with, I teach Indigenous education and some kind of undergraduate teacher courses. And what I tell them oftentimes is, when somebody calls you out on something, and somebody takes you to task for, you know, being racist, being sexist, don't get defensive, thank them. Like, raise them up, because they're doing work for you. They believe in you enough to have that conversation with you. So, you know, be receptive to that. And that's really hard for teachers to hear, because they don't like being wrong. But it's really good advice, I think. So.
Thank you two so much. I'm really grateful for all of the dot connecting in particular. I feel like that has gone on through this conversation. It's, you know, part of why I think we were really grateful to have you two here is just the ways that you went so deep in your particular articles on one very particular relationship with one very particular tree, but that it's clearly that in doing that, you can bring it so much wider. We're not just talking about trees, of course. And so I'm really grateful for that. And also, Adrian, grateful for you bringing this back up, that you know, your first response to us when we asked you to be on the podcast was asking who else would be in the room, and was there anyone else that we could have asked to be here. And I think, just to say, to briefly respond to it on here, as we wrote to you, when we were looking at the issue, as we do with all of them, we're thinking about, like, what are conversations that could be dynamic for readers to have. And the question of whose voices we're bringing in is so important every step of the way, as we work our pieces. But also for us, I think we've realized, we just did a reader survey and confirmed that our readership is so primarily white, even more than we maybe could have expected. And I think for us too, getting comfortable, we are so prioritizing of bringing in both people of color's voices and experiences, and also white folks who are trying to find new ways to live, or maybe old ways to live in this world, and how important it is to be bringing in voices like that, and especially like Jim, for us, an elder in this Detroit community. But to always be asking the question, and just to have your response was helpful for us to know that you're holding us accountable to that. There's lots of other ways this conversation could have looked, but I'm grateful that we had you two here for this one. So happy to say more about that at any point. But I think for now, we're just wrapping up, and want to ask Adrian or Jim if either of you have anything that you would love to share briefly, and then we might turn to a couple comments from Facebook.
Yeah, I would just reaffirm what's being said by you, Kateri, and you, Adrian. It's just an ongoing to downsize white presence and white voices and make space for other voices to emerge. I'm not sure making space is the right way of talking about it, just simply getting out of the way for those voices that are already there to have wider circulation and wider presence on all our multiple media. So amen to that. Last little thing I would share is a tree was part of my earliest sense of empowerment. As a kid, I climbed trees all over the neighborhood, and one day my mom got mad at me for something, and I ran out the back door and climbed the apple tree in the backyard and was up about 20 feet. She was down below yelling up at me, and for the first time, I realized I could do something my parents couldn't do. Even though I did get in trouble once I came down from being able to climb that tree and be up there in it was an experience of empowerment in a way that was new for me as a kid, and part of growing to recognize myself as a person in relationship to my parents. So thanks to a tree for that.
I guess that's me. Right. Yeah, I mean, just in closing, I want to, in kind of that theme of raising up the voices of others, the piece I was writing about Birch emerged from this, 13,000-year-old literary tradition of my people, the Mi'kmaq. And there are those who carry on that tradition today, who do really great literary work on kind of in our traditional hieroglyph system, particularly works by Michelle Syllaboy. She had a book come out last year called I Am Ready that had poetry and photography. And so I would really encourage people to pick that title up, to engage with it. The other one is Peter J. Clare's book, Doppelbagel and Bailet, which is a novel, really amazing novel. I think it was only the second novel ever published by a Mi'kmaq author. So, those two works in particular, I think people, I'll post them in the notes or send them to folk to send out. But those two titles in particular are really good. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks to both of you for the time today and the continued conversation. So we want to end in gratitude for both of you and for the trees by ending with the words that Sarah Holst wrote for this issue that lead us in and out of the issue. And so Kateri and I will read that. Find a tree, Listen with your heart and feet. The soil of your body will guide you. You'll know when you find yours. Pick with silence. Let the air in your lungs be like rustling leaves. Approach your tree gently. Ask for consent. You'll know what is right. Your tree will tell you. Bring a gift. Pick something culturally appropriate for you. I use holy water. A friend brings lavender.
Be with the tree in a way that works for your body and the tree's body. Send your sorrow deep into the earth along rooted pathways. Let the tree hold that which you hold, that has no name and no map. Lay in the roots, stand with forehead to trunk, or do not touch and sit nearby in a chair. Do not rush, do not do, just be.
When you are ready, feel the strength run up the sappy core of your old storied companion and send your desires to the sky. Is there joy among the branches? Transformation? Yell out if necessary. Call, shout, sing yourself back to yourself. You and the tree are made of the same kingdom stuff. Rise slowly. Say thank you, thank you, thank you. Promise to return.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We encourage all that have heard and will in the archive to go and climb a tree for civil disobedience and read some good stories and myths to help us grow in this wisdom. Thank you, Jim and Adrian, for sharing. Thank you, Kateri and Lydia, for hosting. And here we are. We've launched another season of Motor City Wesley, and with great partners like you all has begun. And we're looking for lots of more great things. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. Bye,
Thanks to
everyone.
all.
See ya.